This is lecture 30B in the series The ABCs of Communism on the YouTube channel, The ABCs of Communism, that will corresponds to chapters 47 in next year's ABCs of Communism Bolshevism 2016 edition. Now, when we stopped on this lecture when we stopped on 30A, we had finished the first half of our discussion of Guatemala, and I want to go on now to what happened in Guatemala in the last 45 years. But just before I do that, I want to take a moment here to mention that in the interim, couple of weeks since the last lecture, a gentleman named Steve Horn published an article in Counterpunch, and he has his own website called dsmog.com, DESMOG.com. Steve Horn, again, is his name, published on August 7th. The most interesting part about this nonsense about Hillary Clinton's emails, whether they're classified or not. Nobody in the cat press up here will tell you about the contents. To the degree that they have any discussion about the contents, it's that they want to know what she had to say about Benghazi. You recall the embassy incident there in Libya, as if that was really the critical question. Nobody is telling you the truth about what's in those emails until Mr. Horn published it, and what the truth is that everybody in Mexico is talking about, everybody that reads the newspaper, listens to electronic media, and has an interest anyway in it, is talking about the fact that these emails show that Hillary Clinton and her top advisors had been conspiring to destroy Petróleos Mexicanos, Pemex, since at least 2006. And this is the news that, you remember that in that last lecture we did, which was 28D on the Empire Strikes Back in Mexico, that I said I don't think that Peña Nieto is going to make it through the end of this term. I think that is, he's halfway through that 6-year term now. I think that you could pretty well bet that now that he's been exposed as a traitor to Petróleos Mexicanos and therefore to Mexico, that every would-be gunslinger kid in Mexico is going to be looking for taking a shot at this guy, kind of like the old days when people went to Deadwood to see what they could shoot whether they could shoot Wild Bill Hickok, or when they went down to Tucson thinking maybe they could get into a gunfight with Wyatt Earp. If there's one thing Mexico has plenty of, it's young men with guns who have some kind of reputation that they would like to make in using them. So I wouldn't give Peña Nieto very much chance of finishing this 6-year term, because he was deeply involved, along with Fox and Calderon, in conspiring to destroy the most important institution in Mexican history, and that's Petróleos Mexicanos. I'll let you go to that article in Counterpunch for the details, but I thought I would bring that up right now, not just because that was the last thing we talked about in Mexico, but because Guatemala, in oil and gas terms, is an extension of what is going on, what Pemex has been doing in Zone 5. I think I mentioned to you before that I had logged a couple of top-secret wells for Pemex when I was assistant manager for NL McCullough, a division of NL Industries at that time, that were close to the Mexican-Guatemala border. And so whatever happens oil-wise in Mexico has immediate implications also in Guatemala. All right, having said that, and bolstering again my prediction that Mexico's war between drug gangs is about to turn into a civil war with a political content, which will feature Pemex as the center point of this civil war that's about to kick off there, with political content now instead of just one drug gang against another. Now we'll go ahead and we'll move on to Guatemala proper. You will recall that we had stopped our Guatemalan discussion after an extensive review of Guatemalan history. I started out with a short discussion of Guatemalan prehistory, and then we went through the details of the 500 years that passed after Hernan Cortez gave the Alvarado brothers the right to go to what we can now call Guatemala and try and do there what he had done in Mexico. And the reason I went through those 500 years in as much detail as I did was because very commonly up here people think about Guatemala as if it was just a nothing entity until about 50 years ago when the CIA moved in to overthrow the Arbenz regime. And I wanted you to get a picture of the fact that that's not the case at all. That there was a long history of colonial struggle among the colonial Ronin themselves, of course later became Creoles, Spaniards born in the New World who had no interest in returning to Spain and wanted home rule, and from them against the local native population. So with that in mind, let's go back to the Arbenz regime, which was overthrown in 1954 by the CIA, and nowadays nobody makes any bones about that. There are books have been written about it. The CIA admits that it did it, and but the important thing is that what happened in 1954 was that it marked a turning point for all of Latin America. Everybody read the book The Shark and the Sardines. Everybody was aware of the fact that the CIA had overthrown this government. Even in North America, it was common knowledge, certainly among liberals, that the CIA had been completely out of control in their mind. I say they were completely in control. This is what they were created to do. The CIA was created to be the shock troops for U.S. corporations abroad. So they were doing the job that they had been created to do, even if it's not the job that the liberal Democrats thought that they should be doing. That, at any rate, is the job they've been created to do, and they were doing it. They overthrew Arbenz and put in a guy named Castillo Armas. Now, Castillo Armas himself was assassinated 3 years later. Why the CIA assassinated Castillo Armas, I have not been able to find out to my own satisfaction. There are several different possibilities. One thing we know is, however, that he was assassinated, and the man that took over after that was another general named Miguel Ydígoras Fuentes, but we'll claim Ydígoras in this discussion. Now, by the time I got down to Mexico on my way to Cuba on the 1st of September 1962, Ydígoras was already kind of a well-known figure in Guatemala. Why is that? Well, one reason was he seemed to be kind of insane. He would get on television and he would roller skate around and drink his whiskey while he was doing it, snort a little bit of coke. I mean, he's not the first Latin American dictator to act like that on television, but he was already a well-known figure. Now, another reason that he was well-known down there is because he had been actively involved in slaughtering workers on the United Fruit Company plantations. You'll recall the United Fruit Company is now called Chiquita. Well, at any rate, so I was aware of this. Now, you might recall that I had gone to Mexico originally with a fellow named John Robertson from Boise, Idaho. Now, about this time, John decided that he was going to give up on the idea of going to Cuba. He didn't want to wait around any longer. The missile crisis had not yet broken out, and we didn't really have any idea in September of 1962 what was going to happen next. So John got on a bus and he went to Guatemala, where his idea was that he was going to join up with the rebel forces that were fighting the dictatorship down there. And I didn't see him again for about 4 to 6 weeks when he made it back from Guatemala. And the point is that we were aware of what was going on in Guatemala, which was another Cuban-like civil war. But what had changed everything in this short period of time, from the time we got there on September 1st through the end of October, was that Castro and Kennedy and Khrushchev had come to an agreement where the most important part of which was that Cuba would never again be invaded by the U.S. forces. Now, there was a caveat to that, which was that the CIA would be allowed to go ahead and try and kill Fidel Castro if they could get away with it on an individual basis. A book was later printed by a man that I had known when he was a very young fellow, eventually became head of the General Direction of Intelligence in Cuba, which was called 1001 Ways to Kill Fidel Castro. Now, this was in English, too, so you might think it would have been reviewed in the Cat Press up here, but it didn't show up in the New York Times review of books or anything like that, because they weren't going to review any books written by a communist, and certainly not one of this nature. But the point is that, yes, the Cuban Revolution was protected from an outright U.S. invasion. On the other hand, if the CIA could figure out some way to assassinate Castro, well, that would be outside of the bounds of the Kennedy-Khrushchev agreement. So they immediately went ahead to do what this gentleman is called 1001 Ways to Assassinate Fidel Castro, and in his book he lists each one of them in time as they go along, because his primary job as head of the DGI was to protect Fidel Castro and other members of the government. In other words, kind of like the Secret Service. Its major function is protection, and has a few other things that it does too. Well, at any rate, so there we have my direct personal involvement in both the situation in Mexico with regard to Cuba and by extension, through John Robertson, our involvement in the situation in the Guatemalan Civil War. Okay. Well, now, this guy Edigris, he organized an election, and where he was going to try to put a prettier face on things, but it kind of degenerated into a campaign where he was challenging the Mexican president to a gunfight at a bridge on the border. Again, this is kind of a reflection of the general insanity of the person that the CIA had chosen to run Guatemala at that particular time. In 1963, the Edigris junta called an election where it permitted former President Arevalo to return from exile and contest that election. However, within the Kennedy administration, they decided that there was too much danger that Arevalo might get elected, which would completely wipe out the whole program that the CIA had designed for Guatemala. And so they decided to call off that election, and of course it was called off. Well, the important thing from the communist standpoint is that now that the Cuban Revolution was secure from an outright invasion, they felt, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and the rest of them felt it was possible to send help to defend the Guatemalan peasantry that was being slaughtered by the Guatemalan army. You have to remember that these people in the Petén region, for example, but not just there, on the plantations also, around the mountains and down on the Pacific coast, lived largely what I like to think of as a Neolithic way of life. They're in small villages. They use ground stone tools to grind their corn meal. They use chipped stone tools and chipped glass tools. It's a pretty primitive way of life, and in effect what it had meant was that they were very susceptible to the army rushing in there on helicopters and whatever and killing them. And their only real defense had been to run into Mexico or run deeper into the jungle. Well, at any rate, that CIA campaign was stepped up in 1963, and it got a lot of support from the Kennedy administration. Once Kennedy was gone, of course, from the Johnson administration, by support I mean they just gave a complete go-ahead to the CIA to do whatever they wanted to do down there. Now, in 1962, a man named Julio Cesar Mendez was elected president of Guatemala under the banner of a Democratic opening ticket. He was the candidate of the Revolutionary Party, a center-left party that had its origins in the post-Ubico, we talked about last time, the president, dictator before era. And during this time, rightist paramilitary organizations known as the Mano Blanca, the White Hand, and the anti-communist secret army, Ejército Secreto Anticomunista, were formed, and these groups were the forerunners of what became famous in the 1970s as the death squads of Guatemala and every other part of Central America. Because the CIA was now launching a war against every government that was not completely under their control, from Mexico to Costa Rica. So that included Honduras, Belize, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, which was still under the Somozas, of course, at that time. And Costa Rica had one lucky thing which had kept them out of this, and that was that when Oscar Arias had become president there in the late 1950s Civil War that he fought, he realized that anytime there's an army in Central America, then the CIA will take it over. They will bribe their officers, they will put in the money to run the army at the way they want it run, and so he had gotten rid of the army. That's the important thing. When he got rid of the army in Costa Rica, then all they had was just regular police forces to do regular police work. And there wasn't anything for the CIA to take over. There was no secret police for them to take over, and there was no army for them to take over, and they didn't have any other strategy at the time. They're still working on this Vietnam-style strategy, now, which they want to impose on all of Central America, but in Costa Rica, by accident, they're not able to do that. Costa Rica, you recall, borders on Somozas, Nicaragua. They were just south of that, and of course just north of Panama. Well, in Panama, so in Panama, they were able to do what they wanted to do too. So that's the general picture of how they were setting up the Civil War in Guatemala, but they were also doing it simultaneously, as we're going to see in these other lectures, on their way from all the way from Mexico to Panama. And well, the important thing here is that in 1954, when Arbenz was overthrown in this coup, which was orchestrated and developed completely by the U.S. CIA on the pretext that a socialist government would become a Soviet puppet in the Western Hemisphere, that was their justification for it. But the real reason for it was that they knew that was nonsense. Neither Arevalo or Arbenz were in any way communist. They just wanted to give a better shake to these peasants who they actually believed should be given a share of the profits instead of being worked as slave laborers. What the United Fruit Company wanted, well, that is what's now called Chiquita Brands International, was for the CIA to go in and set up an absolute fascist dictatorship. And so that's what they did. They got them to do that. As we see, Castillo Armas was easily bribed, and they brought him in, and he was assassinated by a member of his personal guard for reasons that are unclear to me. We know the CIA organized it, but we're not quite sure why. After the rigged elections that followed, Idígoras Fuentes assumed power, and of course he did all of these things that we were just talking about, made a kind of a fool out of himself on television, challenging the Mexican president to a duel on the border, doing anything and everything to change the focus of attention from what the CIA was really doing with its death squads. And what they were doing was they would just go into a workers' camp in some place like on a United Fruit Company plantation, and they just kill all of the workers, and then they bring in some more slave laborers. Well, in Montenegro was elected president, and he turned out to be even worse than Idígoras, which was kind of hard to believe. He had this anti-communist secret army created, and another secret organization called the White Hand, and then they developed into the formal death squads that we know about. That you may not recall it, younger people, but at the time in the 1970s, this was a big issue in the U.S., all these death squads that were running around killing everybody that they thought was in opposition or that they considered to be a communist or a pro-communist or a possible communist. One general would say, well, if we don't kill all of the kids here too, they'll just grow up to be communists somewhere down the road. So, this was their attitude about the common people in Mexico. Well, in 1970, a colonel named Carlos Manuel Araña Osorio was elected president, and by 1972, members of the guerrilla movement entered the country from Mexico and settled in the Western Highlands. Now, by this time, the Cuban DGI has sent quite a few agents to try to help these people learn how to defend themselves. And the guerrilla war, therefore, has taken on a new and a more complex structure than it had 10 years earlier when John and I were down there. Well, at any rate, now, in 1974, another guy comes to power named Efrain Rios Montt. Now, Rios Montt is back in the news in Guatemala today because he's guilty of so many war crimes, which is another way of saying the CIA is guilty of a lot of war crimes because they put him in power. And his defense is that he's incapable, because of his age, standing trial. So he's been in and out of a mental hospital. Just yesterday I noticed that he had gotten out of that mental hospital again, but he says he's still incompetent to stand trial. What's going to happen, I don't know. But the point is that this CIA campaign against Guatemala didn't end a few years ago with the end of the actual armed insurrection itself, and it goes on to this very day. And actually what the CIA is trying to do is to kick off a new war in all of these all of these Central American countries, and start the whole process of the 70s and 80s all over again. Well, in 1976, in the early part of the year, in February, a major earthquake destroyed several cities and caused more than 25,000 deaths, especially among the poor, whose housing was substandard. And the government's failure to respond rapidly to the aftermath of the earthquake and to relieve homelessness added to the death toll, and this gave rise to widespread discontent, which of course contributed to the growing popular unrest. And in the meantime, the guerrilla movement is getting stronger and building base areas in the mountains and the hills of Guatemala. In 1978, in a fraudulent election, General Romeo Lucas Garcia assumed power. And the 1970s now saw the rise of two new guerrilla organizations, one called the Guerrilla Army of the Poor, EGP, and the Organization of the People in Arms, ORPA. They began guerrilla attacks that included urban and rural warfare against the Army and some of the civilian supporters of the Army. The Army and the paramilitary forces responded with a brutal counterinsurgency campaign that resulted in many tens of thousands of civilian deaths. In 1979, U.S. President Jimmy Carter, who had until then been providing public support for the government forces, ordered a ban on all military aid to the Guatemalan Army because of its widespread and systematic abuse of human rights. However, this was just cover. Carter was trying to pacify the liberals in the U.S. With all of this talk about he's going to cut off aid to the Guatemalan Army. It never happened. The CIA kept doing everything they'd been doing before, but they just were supposed to do it more clandestinely than they had been. And so, in other words, Jimmy Carter was not some kind of great savior of the Guatemalan revolution. He was just a better con man, a kind of early Obama. On January 31st of 1980, a group of the indigenous Quiche people took over the Spanish embassy and to protest army massacres in the countryside. The Guatemalan government, however, was ordered by the CIA to wipe them out. And so what they did was to attack the embassy. Now, the CIA made a press release that the reason the embassy had been burned down was because the guerrillas had done it. What turned all of that into a lie that it was quickly recognized in Guatemala and therefore throughout the Spanish-speaking world was that the Spanish ambassador survived the fire, and he said that the Guatemalan police intentionally killed almost everyone inside the embassy and set the fire to erase traces of their acts. Now, as a result, the government of Spain terminated diplomatic relations with Guatemala, and of course the CIA had done it again, and they had placed the U.S. administration in the hot seat because they were the ones that had given the order to invade that embassy in the first place, then to kill everybody inside it, then to burn it down, and then to try and cover up the crime. Well, in 1982, Rios Montt was named president of the military junta. And instead of changing anything, he continued the bloody campaign of torture, forced disappearances, and scorched earth warfare. The country became a pariah state. At least 75,000 civilians were killed in this period of the administration of Rios Montt, and of course that's why he's on trial now for war crimes. In 1982, the four guerrilla groups, EGP, ORPA, and two new ones, FAR and PGT, you can read the book and find out what these initials stand for in Spanish when you get it next year, merged and formed the URNG. Now this was influenced by the Salvadoran guerrilla FMLN, the Nicaraguan FSLN, and Cuba's DGI. In order to become stronger, the Cuban agents had brought in these experienced fighters from El Salvador, which we're going to get to in a couple of lectures from now, and from Honduras, and from Nicaragua, and of course they're old guys, and they had now set up a really effective military operation that was defeating the Guatemalan government everywhere. But in the process, there were civilians being caught in the middle, and if the army caught them, they would just slaughter them. So 45,000 Guatemalans fled across the border into Mexico. And the Mexican government placed the refugees in camps in Chiapas and Tabasco. I remember this well because by this time I was back in Mexico for the second time, first time in '62 and now in '82, and this time I was running an oil field service company there as an assistant manager, and I was actually doing the secret wells for Pemex on the Guatemalan border, well aware of the fact that these crazy Guatemalan soldiers could try and come across the border, and not at all certain that the Mexican army troops that were supposed to protect us wouldn't turn around and run. So it was one of those situations where you got to lug this well with a pistol on your hip and an automatic weapon somewhere in your baggage, just in case we have to shoot our way out of this mess. Rios Montt was overthrown by General Oscar Humberto Mejia Vitores, who called for the National Constitutional Assembly to write a new constitution, leading to a free election in 1986, which was held and was won by Vinicio Cerezo Arevalo, the candidate of the Christian Democratic Party, the guy that had preceded the presidency preceded Arbenz in the Guatemalan presidency. Now, in 1992, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to a woman named Rigoberta Menchú for her efforts to bring international attention to the U.S.-backed Guatemalan government genocide against the indigenous population. I've noticed that she's in the news again because she got another one of these International Human Rights Awards recently, and she was one of those that was smart enough to stay out of the reach of the government troops or the CIA agents, knowing of course that if they caught her they'd kill her. This government was overthrown in 1982, and Efrain Rios Montt was named president of the military junta, and then he did all those things that he was now being tried for. Well, after 1996, when the Guatemalan Civil War ended formally, there was a peace accord between the guerrillas and the government, negotiated by the United Nations through intense brokerage by nations such as Norway and Spain. Both sides made major concessions. The guerrilla fighters disarmed and received land to work. According to the UN-sponsored Truth Commission, called in English the Commission for Historical Clarification, government forces and state-sponsored CIA paramilitaries were responsible for over 93% of the human rights violations during the Civil War in Guatemala. Over the last few years, millions of documents related to these crimes committed during that Civil War were found abandoned by the former Guatemalan police. The families of over 45,000 Guatemalan activists are now reviewing the documents, which have been digitized, and this could lead to further legal actions. Paradoxically, the current democratically elected president, Otto Perez Molina, could be a barrier to further legal action as he, a retired general, was head of the intelligence in Guatemala during the Civil War. I noticed that his daughter is running in the current elections for president of Guatemala. and her major issue so far has been the defense of her father. Well, at any rate, during the first 10 years, the victims of the state-sponsored terror were primarily students, workers, professionals, and opposition figures, but in the later years, they were tens of thousands of mostly rural Maya farmers and non-combatants. In other words, just more masses of civilians that were not even politically oriented. More than 450 Mayan villages were destroyed during this period of time. Over 1 million people were displaced within Guatemala as refugees. According to this report, the Recuperación de la Memoria Histórica, some 200,000 people died. More than 1 million people forced to flee their homes. Hundreds of villages destroyed. As according to this officially chartered UN Historical Clarification Commission. And as I say, 93% of all of these violations were done by the CIA and its government. So, the Truth Commission considered that the Guatemalan state had been engaged in an international policy of genocide against particular ethnic groups during the Civil War. In 1999, U.S. President Bill Clinton stated that the U.S. was wrong to have provided support to Guatemala military figures that took part in brutal civilian killings. You know how Clinton is. He'll say, yes, we tortured all of these people and that was wrong. So he says this was wrong too. Well, at any rate, since the peace accords, Guatemala has witnessed both economic growth and successive democratic elections, most recently in 2011. However, in the 2011 elections, Otto Perez Molina of the Patriotic Party had won the presidency and assumed office in 2012, and since then, everything has remained the same, except that he has allowed Rios Montt, the former dictator, to appear in a Guatemalan court on genocide charges, and specifications include over 100 incidents involving 1,771 deaths, 1,445 rapes, and the displacement of nearly 30,000 Guatemalans during his 17-month rule from 1982 to 1983. So you can see the various press references from the Washington Post, BBC, LA Times, and the Spanish 21st century, Siglo XXI. The prosecution wanted Rios Montt incarcerated because of his potential for flight, but the judge ruled that he could remain outside on bail. Of course, you know, all these things are arranged with money. He was placed under house arrest and was watched by the Guatemalan National Civil Police. On May 10th of 2013, he was found guilty and sentenced to 80 years in prison. Now that marks the first time that a former head of state was found guilty for genocide by a national court. The conviction was overturned, however, with Montt's trial scheduled to resume in January 2015. And as I told you, here we are in August, and just yesterday I see that he's been in and out of this mental hospital, and his claim is that he's too crazy to stand trial. He might be right about that. Guatemala Supreme Court has cleared the way for Zuri Rios Sosa, daughter of former dictator Rios Montt, to run for president in the country's upcoming general elections in September. And of course, her position is that her father saved Guatemala from communism. The decision from Guatemala's highest court on Wednesday will allow Rios Sosa, his daughter, to register as a candidate for her father's Christian conservative Vision with Values party, known as Viva, after the elections body rejected her candidacy. Well, this story could go on, and I'm not going to bother with it because there's a couple ways I want to conclude this particular lecture. What you can see is that the U.S. went all out in Guatemala, and you're going to see that at the same time they were doing that also in Honduras, Belize, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, and we're going to get to those lectures next, and that this was an exact copy of what the CIA was doing in Vietnam. Before and after the Kennedy assassination at the end of 1963, and then when they finally realized that they had failed in Vietnam, was when the Army decided that it could solve the matter by sending 500,000 troops over there, which eventually they did under LBJ. But in Latin America, that is in Central America, The Army didn't want to get involved again in Central America. The Army and the Marines had been involved down there in the early part of the 1900s, and they didn't really want to go back. And besides, the Army and the Marines are saying, we can only handle one major war at a time, and we're going to have our hands full with Vietnam. And we can come back and readdress this question of Cuba and its constant intervention in the civil wars in Central America. Okay, so that was where the U.S. was at in these years that were so critical, these Rios Montt years. And before that, this crazy guy Idigueras, and in the subsequent years, their whole policy was based on slaughtering as many civilian employees of the United Fruit Company as they could if they suspected that they were in any way involved in subversive activities. One way they could be involved in subversive activities would be if they were to demand wages of more than $1 a day. That was supposed to be completely outrageous. The United Fruit Company wouldn't go along with it. And of course, any kinds of welfare benefits for themselves, their wives, their children, and so on, all of this was considered to be proof of a communist status, and the only way that the CIA knew how to handle it was to kill them. Well, at any rate, so we have this general picture going on in Guatemala. I want you to realize that it's not just Guatemala. As you're going to see in the next lectures, exactly the same thing was going on in Honduras. Exactly the same thing in El Salvador. And then, of course, exactly the same thing was going on in Nicaragua. And in all of these countries, what all of this mass murder did was to feed huge numbers of people who felt that they had no choice. They're either going to have to run a long ways away, for example, to the United States, try to get a job in a car wash or working as a servant someplace in a household, or run away to Mexico and hope that there they can make some kind of life for themselves more familiar to what they were doing in Guatemala, or join the army, the rebel army, and fight against these oppressors. And the truth of the matter is they did all of these things. Some ran to North America, some ran to Mexico, some ran into the mountains and joined the guerrillas, and the more slaughter that went on in the countryside, and it was constant. It was constant from 1960 through 1985, 1986 in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, as you're going to see, we're going to get there, and of course it went on in Nicaragua until 1979. So that is the general picture as far as Guatemala is concerned. There's a lot of problem right now in this particular area because Central America has always been subjected to intense droughts, and they're going through one right now. Now, in the past, there have been droughts which were externally causal, as I mentioned in the lecture last time, to regime change, so to speak, in Guatemala. That is, in the early classic and the late classic periods, advanced theocratic chiefdoms and then the early kingdoms were frequently subjected to social stresses because of these droughts, and then, of course, they, being inherently weak anyway, would collapse and be overthrown, and then some new system would have to come into existence. Now, that's happening again right now, from everywhere from Mexico south to Panama, and it's going to have different responses in different places. Nicaraguans are the ones who seem to be doing the best because they have this new Chinese canal going through, and there's a lot of money flowing into Nicaragua, so that of all of the countries, not only do they have an honest government, which is rare, but they have a government which has managed to get this Chinese canal under construction, and that's going to bring an awful lot of money into Nicaragua. What we're going to see in the next few years is that Nicaragua will become the economic powerhouse of Central America. Well, of course, that's got the CIA worried. So they keep trying to find some way to subvert the government in Nicaragua. But as you're going to see when we get to Nicaragua in a few lectures from now, that the last 50 years have given the Sandinista National Liberation Front all the experience it needs in how to fight U.S. imperialism. And the chances of them being able to overthrow the Ortega government are somewhere between 0 and 0. Now, they may have more luck in overthrowing the Guatemalan government and in Honduras and Belize and in El Salvador, because they're better positioned there, and there isn't any decent government in power in any of those countries to really effectively resist. Although the Cubans are doing the best they can to support the democratically elected governments in El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala, it's an uphill fight when the people themselves are not capable of defending themselves with a government like the Ortega government in Nicaragua. So we're just going to have to see how that plays out. But one thing you can also see is that no matter what, the U.S. plan in Latin America continues to be to subvert every progressive and democratic regime that exists down there, and they will never give that up until they're actually forced out. Now, they've been forced out of Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador, but they keep trying to mount counter-revolutionary attacks, most recently at Ecuador. It didn't get anywhere, but it's not for lack of trying that they've been staging violent, the CIA has been organizing violent demonstrations down there since January of this year, and they're going to keep doing it. They tried in Bolivia, but the Bolivians are too smart for this, and Evo Morales has been able to prevent any of the CIA from getting any, even though it's tried, as I mentioned in the first lecture on Bolivia that we did in this series, it's tried very intensively to create a revolutionary, counter-revolutionary situation there, but it's failed there. It's failing now in Ecuador. It's failing in Venezuela, and of course Cuba got lucky because they got rid of all their counter-revolutionary elements who fled the country in the period from 1959 to the end of 1962, thinking that if they went to Miami and just waited it out, that the U.S. government would eventually overthrow Castro. Well, of course, that didn't happen, and like emigres often end up saying, they always say, we'll come back someday, I mean, no matter what country, where you are in the world, but of course, most of the time, they don't come back. Whether they were Hungarians heading for New York, or Italians heading for New York, or whatever, thinking that the day would come when they would go back to Hungary or Italy. Well, a day never came, they never went back, for the most part. Same thing happened to these Cubans who thought they would go to Miami and wait for the U.S. government to overthrow Castro. Well, that didn't happen, and as you saw here just a few days ago, the Kerry finally had to go to Havana and open up the U.S. embassy there as part of this general the U.S. has given up on overthrowing Castro, and they've given up on isolating him. They'll never give up on trying to overthrow him. But, you know, the Cubans have had 55 years now of experience in fighting U.S. imperialism directly while in power. So the chances that they're going to be able to come up with anything that's going to successfully remove Fidel and Raul from power is, again, 0-0. So Cuba's safe. Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia will be pretty quickly. Bolivia is the safest of those latter three. I think it shows that Che Guevara was right and Fidel Castro was right in sending him to Bolivia, because that was the center of the South American continent. It was the easiest place to trigger revolutions in the surrounding countries, and it was the easiest place to defend. And now, of course, now Che Guevara is a national hero in Bolivia. There isn't enough good things that Evo Morales could say about him all of the time. So even though the U.S. got away with assassinating him there, all they did in the end was to create a living legend out of Che Guevara. So with these comments on the general picture in Central America, we begin our analysis of a country-by-country struggle in the last 50 years of U.S. imperialism against the pro-communist forces and the communist parties of all of these countries. One final comment. The biggest assist that the anti-communist forces had in these countries in the 1960s came from the Khrushchev revisionists. And this lasted right on up until the last of these traitors in Moscow, Gorbachev, and right up until 1990. But it was in a period when there were still plenty of honest Marxists of the communist parties of Latin America. And in country after country, once they absorbed the blows of modern revisionism, they were able to come back again. And at first, Khrushchev was very clever in his, because defense of the Cuban Revolution made people pay attention to his revisionist bullshit that he was publishing and talking about and trying to force onto the communist parties of Latin America, Central America in this particular case, in the 1960s. But the people like, and he had his stooges. Khrushchev had a guy named Gus Hall in New York who ran the CPUSA for him. And that eventually Gorbachev would take over, and he'd have his stooge, a guy named Sam Webb in the United States, who managed to lead the remnant CPUSA into non-existence. They still have a website, and that's about it. They don't publish anything anymore in a printed form. I'm not sure whether they're trying to get anything out in literature-wise or not, but it's just an FBI front. So everybody knows that. The most dangerous front that has come up that I'm aware of has been this Trotskyist party called PSL, Party of Socialism and Liberation. But Trotskyism is another matter altogether, which we don't want to get into now. I'm just reviewing some of the things that have happened inside the USA that were important in these particular years. So in these years, people like the Prietos, for example, would join up with the younger guys that are now down there in the Zapatista National Liberation Front, and they would start to provide, well, they created an armed base area like Mao Zedong had in the Hunan Jiangsu region to begin with, the Long March, then in the Yan'an, a place where the army can't get to them. So the big lesson is, if you want to stay alive, you're going to have to get into a place where the CIA and its puppet armies can't kill you. And of course that's a lesson that's kind of hard to learn, because once you learn it, you're dead. So unless you're looking at it from a distance, so it takes a while for that to set in. But it did set in, as you've seen in Guatemala. They set up base areas. Their guerrilla army got bigger. The Cubans helped unite the different guerrilla factions into one guerrilla army, and eventually they were able to force the CIA and its puppet government into a 1996 agreement, and that put a momentary end, at least. For the last 19 years, there's been a half-assed kind of parliamentary regime in Guatemala, which the CIA now wants to get rid of and reinstitute fascism in its old image. Only time will tell whether that actually happens. So, in the next lecture, we're going to take this south to Honduras and Belize. Now, Belize is what originally was called British Honduras, and as such, it's part of that entire Mosquito Coast. Mosquito meaning M-I-S-K-I-T-O, the Mosquito Indians, from that goes up to the Yucatan area where Belize fronts on the sea, down through the entire coast to the end of until the beginning of Costa Rica, the entire Central American coast. And that is going to be important because, as you're going to see when we get to the lecture on Nicaragua, the CIA managed to get a base built among some of the Mosquito Indians in Nicaraguan territory. Now, eventually that base was defeated, but it was a long armed struggle, which in the U.S. is called the Contra War, on the Iran-Contra scandal. Some of you that are my age will certainly remember that. Some of you younger people will have read about it. I'm just mentioning it here because this is an area where they managed to find a certain amount of support and to create a certain amount of support, which they then turned against the revolutionary movements in the countries of Honduras and Nicaragua and Belize, or what you guys usually call Belize. And with those comments, we are prepared to go on to our discussion of Honduras and Belize, which we'll treat together, Honduras and British Honduras, for several different historical reasons that I think will become apparent. From there, we're going to move on to the Civil War El Salvador, which occurred during the last 50 years, and it's almost an exact repeat of what happened in Guatemala, as is the Honduran Civil War, which is about to kick off there in 1960 also. And again, it's always the same story. The CIA goes in there and they organize these massacres of the local population, and they buy off certain fascist generals and begin to become the financiers of their armies. So with that comment, we'll just stop on this lecture for today. That concludes on our lecture 30B, and we'll get ready for lecture 31 on Honduras and Belize.